Good evening, everyone. I'm Dana Cunningham, Dean of the Tisch College of Civic Life here at Tufts. It is my privilege to welcome you virtually to Tisch College and to the Tufts University School of Medicine. Before we get started, let me acknowledge our co-sponsors for this event. Along with the School of Medicine, we are partnering with the Africana Center, the Political Science Department, the Office of the Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences, and the Department of Studies in Race, Colonialism, and Diaspora. Thank you all. Your generous collaboration, along with the support and leadership of Susan and Alan Solomont, make events like this one possible. Together, we are honored to welcome journalist and best-selling author Isabel Wilkerson, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Humanities Medal, to this Susan and Alan Solomont Distinguished Speaker Series event. Ms. Wilkerson's most recent book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, is this year's Tufts University School of Medicine Common Book, a program that Tisch College is proud to co-sponsor. And we are pleased to see so many medical school students, faculty, staff, and alumni in tonight's virtual audience. In addition to Caste, Isabel Wilkerson is the author of the critically acclaimed The Warmth of Other Suns. And in the words of the American Prospect magazine, her work is, quote, the missing puzzle piece of our country's history. Caste was published in August 2020 and became a #1 New York Times bestseller. Dwight Garner of the Times called it an instant American classic and almost certainly the keynote nonfiction book of the American century thus far. Ms. Wilkerson won the Pulitzer Prize for her deeply humane narrative writing while serving as Chicago bureau chief of the New York Times in 1994, making her the first Black woman in the history of American journalism to win a Pulitzer Prize and the first African American to win for individual reporting. In 2016, President Barack Obama awarded her the National Humanities Medal for championing the stories of unsung history. In my view, her work is essential to exploring the ways in which the destinies of very different peoples can be intertwined and to stimulate robust discussion about the challenges to and the possibilities for multiracial democracy in this country. Joining Ms. Wilkerson in conversation later tonight is Dr. Joyce Sackie, Associate Provost and Chief Diversity Officer for Tufts Health Sciences Schools on the Boston and Grafton campuses. Dr. Sackie is a member of the Tufts Academic and Provost Councils and a leader of the university's anti-racism initiative, recently co-chairing the institutional audit and targeted action and equity and inclusion work streams. Dr. Sackie also serves as Dean for Multicultural Affairs and Global Health and the Dr. Jane Murphy Gauguin Professor. She oversees the medical school's key diversity and inclusion initiatives, including its pipeline programs targeting underrepresented minority students at the high school, college, and postgraduate level. Her office also coordinates opportunities for students to gain exposure to global public health and health delivery in international settings. Prior to joining Tufts, Dr. Sackie was assistant professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School and attending physician in medicine at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, where she had also completed her residency in internal medicine and served as primary care chief resident. Before I hand things off to Ms. Wilkerson, a quick note about the format for tonight's hour-long event. Ms. Wilkerson will share a prepared lecture with us for about 30 minutes. And then she'll be joined on screen by Dr. Sackie for a moderated conversation before we open the program to audience questions. Thank you all for being with us, and please join me in welcoming Isabel Wilkerson.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today. Thank you so much for choosing this book as a common read. When you're in the midst of the research and you can barely see your way through to the final page, much less trying to imagine what's going to happen on the other side once it's out into the world. You can never imagine it, and I am so grateful for your embrace of the concept your embrace of the mission and the purpose of the work. So here we are meeting virtually in the midst of the ravages of climate change. We've seen New York underwater, New Orleans struck by wind, and California literally on fire. We're in the midst of political upheaval and a global pandemic that continues to threaten us as the virus mutates faster than we can keep up with it, worsened by and actually laying bare the deep divide that threatens democracy itself. In recent times, it's not been unusual to hear someone say something along the lines of, "This is not my country," or "I don't recognize my country," or "This is not what America stands for." And whenever I hear that very heartfelt sentiment, I often say to myself that, and remind myself that to me, it's an indicator that not enough of us know our country's true history. Because if we knew our country's true history, then we would know that our country is in some ways like a patient with a pre-existing condition like heart disease. And if a patient with heart disease has a heart attack or myocardial infarction, you might be alarmed, you might be upset, you might be moved to action, but you would not be surprised if a heart patient without intervention or treatment had a heart attack. And so in some ways, that is what our country is calling upon us to recognize, is that this has been underneath the surface. This is part of our inheritance, the divisions that we've seen laid bare in recent years. And this is what we're called upon to do, is to better understand it. The book that brought me to your attention is a book that I did not wish to write, but which I was called to write in the era in which we find ourselves. It demanded to be written. And then shortly after it was released in August 2020, I had to go out into a virtual book tour where everywhere and so many things that we do now, there's a veil of a screen between us, and that's what I was having to do, continuing to have to do. And after it was shortly released, one of the very earliest events was one where one of the facilitators and moderators said to me, "We've been through so much as a nation. We're in the midst of this global pandemic. We are in the midst of the uprisings over what happened to George Floyd. We're in the midst of a fraught political presidential campaign. And then this summer, you drop Caste on us." And I said to him, equally as heartfelt and goodwill, I said to him, "I did not drop Caste on anyone. Caste is with us whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. Caste is working within our society whether we see it or not. Caste is with us whether we recognize that it is there or not." And so here we are. One example of that is that here we are in the middle of the second year of this global pandemic, with the latest mutation surging, even as we feel as if we have been making progress, and then we discover that there's something else that has yet to be done. Here we are also having to come to terms with the consequences of hierarchy and caste, because we have to come to some way of understanding the fact that the United States, the richest and most technologically advanced nation in the world, leads the world in the grimmest of distinctions, for which there would be no rational explanation if you think about it. More than 740,000 people have died of COVID-19 in the United States, by far more than any other nation. And when it comes to COVID cases, the United States has been leading the world with confirmed cases since the early going, since the time that it crossed over into the West. And this is millions more than the second ranked country historically throughout this pandemic, meaning India. We also know that the United States has the lowest vaccination rate in the G7. The numbers that our country has are in line not with our peer nations, but with the developing world. How is it that two very, very different countries, the oldest democracy in the world, the United States, or one of the oldest, and the largest democracy, being India, are being stricken with these numbers? One country has the world's oldest caste system, and the other has a less recognized one. A caste system, through its social controls and stigma and other pillars of caste, embeds and foments division. It depends upon division. It programs people into believing that they have no stake in the well-being of those that they've been told are beneath them, those that they are told are unworthy, undeserving. It makes for a less magnanimous society, a built-in us versus them distance between groups. It affects policy, it affects how people vote, it affects where people choose to live and send their children to school. It affects who people will hire, who people will grant a mortgage to. It affects where the country chooses to invest or disinvest. There are many, many reasons why we find ourselves in the current crisis, but I would suggest that caste and the divisions that it sows surely is a factor that's made it even more challenging to overcome this challenge and this crisis that we are facing. It's literally costing lives, and it's a global tragedy that we are facing. Caste is not a word that's often applied to the United States, and yet Dr. Martin Luther King came to the realization of the connection between the ancient Indian caste system hierarchy in India and the social structure, the social and political structure of the United States. And he came to this realization when he made a historic trip to India in the winter of 1959. He'd always wanted to get to India because he'd been so inspired by the nonviolent protest philosophy of Mohandas K. Gandhi, and he finally had the chance to go in 1959. When he arrived, he was greeted as a visiting dignitary. It turned out that everywhere he went, people recognized him. They wanted his autograph because it turned out that people in India had been paying close attention to the liberation movement, the liberation efforts of Black people in the United States. While Dr. King was there in the country, in India, he wanted to visit with people who were then known as untouchables. Now they are known as Dalits, but he wanted to visit with them. So he made a trip to the southern part of the country, and he visited a school that was populated by children, young people who were from families then known as untouchables. And upon arrival, the principal was very, very excited to greet Dr. King, and he gathered the students together, and he said, the principal said to the students, he said, "Young people, I wish to introduce you to a fellow untouchable from the United States of America." When Dr. King heard that language applied to him, he first bristled at it. He actually was quite peeved. He was floored to hear this language applied to him. He did not see himself in this way. He did not see himself as being at the bottom caste. He didn't think of himself in caste terms at all. He was someone who had a PhD. He was leading the liberation movement of African Americans. He did not see himself in this way. And then he thought about it. He thought about what was at that very moment, 20 million Black people in the United States who were at that very moment being held in a fixed place, being excluded from the body politic, being excluded from being able to vote, being excluded from entire spheres of industries and occupations, being restricted as to where they could live, where they could go to school, restricted in every sphere of life. And that their efforts at being recognized as the citizens that they actually were and had been were being met with tremendous hostility, resentment, and in fact, violence. And so he thought about it and he said to himself, I am an untouchable, and every Black person in the United States is an untouchable too. Dr. King came to the recognition, the realization of the connection between these very, very different countries and very, very different societies, but having this intersection, having this aspect in common. And he came to this realization because those who knew best what a caste system was, those who were assigned at the very bottom of the caste system in India, instantly recognized caste when they saw it, instantly recognized who belonged where in the American version, the American caste system, and they connected the system of hierarchy in this country to their own. Again, caste is not a word that's often applied to the United States. It's considered the language of India or feudal Europe, but it turns out that that anthropologists and social scientists, social sociologists who were studying the Jim Crow South while it was in progress during the depths of Jim Crow in the 1930s and 40s, went into the Jim Crow South, risking their lives in order to study it, risking their lives because they had to live according to the strictures These were matters of life and death, and they literally risked their lives in order to spend months and in some cases years to study and to understand the phenomenon of what was going on in the South and how to characterize it. And they emerged from their research using the language of caste. Any number of I should say that to define caste is that caste is essentially an artificial, arbitrary, graded ranking of human value in a society. It's what determines one's standing, respect, benefit of the doubt, access to resources or denial of access to resources. It determines one's standing in so many spheres of life. It determines assumptions of competence, worthiness, intelligence, whether one will be protected by the authorities or attacked by the authorities. Caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. Any number of arbitrary metrics could be used to rank people in a caste system. Ethnicity, religion, heritability, language, place of origin, any number of metrics could be used to rank people and to divide them. In our country, the metric that the early colonists used to divide and to rank people, to determine who would be slave or free, who would have rights or no rights, not even over their own bodies, who would profit from the labor extracted from others, or who could be reduced to a commodity, who could be bought, who could be sold, who could be won in a bet or given away as a wedding present, was the metric of what we now have come to see as race. That means that the colonists chose to use otherwise neutral physical characteristics that should have no meaning other than the range of human physical manifestation. And they took those characteristics and they used them to assign people to an inherited role in a hierarchy before there was even the United States of America. They used these otherwise neutral physical characteristics to determine who could own property and who could be property. Thus, slavery became the foundation of a hierarchy built on greed and exploitation, was succeeded by the Jim Crow regime, and which casts a shadow over the country to the current day. Those of us alive today are tasked with, I would say, burdened with the responsibility of somehow finding a way to explain to succeeding generations, how is it that we all could have witnessed a man killed before our very eyes, George Floyd, in May of 2020, something that should not have happened to any human being anywhere on this planet, much less in our own country. We saw a man killed in real time, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. We saw the life drained from George Floyd. We saw his humanity stripped from him. And over what? Over the accusation of his presumably having attempted to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. This is an infraction that we learned at the trial of his assailant was not even an arrestable offense. It was an infraction that normally would be handled with a citation and a court date. That means that George Floyd should be alive today. And then we saw a very different side of caste, a very different manifestation of caste earlier this year on January 6th. And in that case, we saw a mob of insurrectionists break into the citadel of democracy. We saw a mob of insurrectionists break into the United States Capitol, rampage through Statuary Hall, ransack the belongings of lawmakers. We saw lawmakers having to barricade themselves to protect themselves from the mob. We saw the mob attack police officers. We know that half a dozen officers died as a result of that rampage. But then we saw something later that day that was an indicator, was a way of understanding and seeing caste play out. And that is that we saw those same people walk down the steps of the Capitol with their lives, something that was denied George Floyd merely months before. Because not enough of us know our country's history, far too many of us speak of slavery, the originator, the origins of the divisions that we have inherited. Too many people speak of slavery as merely a sad, dark chapter in our country's history, when in fact, it was the foundation of the social, political, and economic order of our country. Slavery lasted for so long, that lasted for 246 years. That's a quarter of a millennium. It lasted for 12 generations. How many greats do we have to add to the word grandparent to begin to imagine how long slavery lasted in this country? Another way of looking at it is slavery lasted for so long that it will not be until next year, 2022, that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as slavery lasted on this soil. It lasted for so long that no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as African Americans were enslaved. That will not happen until the year 2111. It will not be until the second decade of the 22nd century that African Americans will have been free for as long as they were enslaved. It will be that long before they will have reached parity. Black people will reach parity between slavery and freedom. We have not addressed, much less reconciled, what we're facing as a nation. No one was held to account for those 246 years of enslavement. No one was held to account for the rupture of secession and civil war. Instead, there are monuments to those men. Because we have not addressed, much less reconciled, this history, we saw a Confederate flag inside the United States Capitol, something that we will have to explain to succeeding generations as to how this could have occurred. How is it that in 2021, the Confederate, a rioter in 2021 was able to deliver the Confederate flag farther than Robert E. Lee himself? What we are witnessing are the unheeded voices of Black and Brown people. We are witnessing the unheeded voices of marginalized people, the unheeded voices of Black women in particular, who have been sounding this alarm for decades, the silenced Cassandras of our era, many of whom saw some of this coming. What we are witnessing are the ongoing consequences of our racial caste system and its response to threats to its existence, or more specifically, those who see dominance as their birthright, desperate to protect it at all costs. We saw the pictures and the videos of the United States Capitol under siege. We saw the mobs, enraged and self-righteous rioters, literally climbing the walls to disrupt democracy itself. But later in the day, we saw a video, a very, very different scene that circulated in this video that circulated, showing a scene at the Capitol after it had been cleared of the mob. And in this scene, there was a crew of janitors who were brought in to clean up after the rampage. There they were, laboring in their uniforms, bent over with mops and brooms and with masks over their faces. They were, to a person, all Black. There was a white police officer who stood over them, surveilling them, the only one barefaced without a mask. I saw instantly the people assigned to the subordinated caste for 400 years, still consigned to their historic role of serving, cleaning up after those programmed to see themselves as superior, dominant, supreme. Had people who looked like the janitors in that crew, seen working late into the night, deigned to burst through police barricades, deigned to break into the United States Capitol? Well, we know what would have come of that. It is inconceivable. It is unthinkable. They would not have lived to tell. This is the enduring nature of hierarchy, the entitlement of the dominant to assert and to take what it perceives to be a birthright, and the restrictions, continuing restrictions on the most mundane aspects of everyday life for those who have descended from those who've been subordinated from the beginning. The scenes of siege of our nation's capital may have looked like another country, but it is ours. What we saw may have looked like a different century, but it is ours. This may have looked like a long ago battle over justice waged and presumably won back in another era, but it is ours still. This is the country's karmic moment of truth, particularly as we approach the next 2 decades at which the country's demographics are expected or projected to be unlike any that anyone in the country has ever known, with the historic majority potentially not being in the majority. And this then reminds us that this is the country's karmic moment of truth. And we have 20 years to prepare and to get it right for the betterment of everyone in this country. The question would be, will the United States, will our country follow the path of darkness and division, of hate and hierarchy that have riven it for centuries? Or will it rise to what Dr. King called the heights of the majestic and live up to its creed, become and defend true democracy with liberty and justice for every single one of us? What we have seen has made it wrenchingly clear that Dr. King's mission has not been completed. It will be up to all of us, and particularly the prime beneficiaries of our country's 400-year-old social order, to make it so. Not only for our communities, our children, our country, but for the species and for the planet itself. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Wilkerson, for your wonderful, wonderful lecture. And I have questions that came from reading your book, and your lecture has stimulated even more questions. So one of the things that really jumped out at me is just the power of storytelling that you use throughout the book, and the analogies that you use. And I thought that the absolutely favorite analogy in the book, and I quote, is when you said, "America is an old house. We can never declare the work over." However, I just heard you use another analogy, which I feel like now it's in competition with the notion of old house. And that is the analogy you just described of America being a patient with pre-existing conditions. And if you don't treat the pre-existing conditions, you should not be surprised that a patient who has maybe heart disease or risk for heart disease would have another heart attack. As a physician, and I suspect as many of the students on this call, as medical students and public health students, I'm sure they can resonate very much with that analogy as well. So I want us to just start a little bit from the beginning. You mentioned just a little while ago in your lecture, and also I believe in your acknowledgement session, that this is a book, in quote, "This is a book that I did not seek to write, but had to write in the era in which we find ourselves." Can you elaborate on that? What led you, what compelled you to write this book?
Thank you so much for that question, and thank you so much for recognizing that analogy. I didn't know how well it would go over, and I want to say that I hope I got points for myocardial infarction.
Yes, you did, absolutely.
Thank you. So I have to say that anyone who read the first book, The Warmth of Other Suns, has been exposed to the idea, the concept of caste, because I was building and telling the story of 6 million Black people who had to, or felt they had to, flee the Jim Crow regime during much of the 20th century, from World War I into the 1970s, and thus, essentially helping to create the demographics of all the cities in the North and the Midwest and West. As I was telling that, and I was having to describe what was it that would propel people to seek political asylum within the borders of their own country. And in order to do that, I had to somehow, I had to do the research in order to make that era come alive. And in doing so, I discovered the work of the anthropologists who've gone before me, and who provide, one of the most important documents of what life was actually like from an outsider's scholarly perspective. And it was, incredible testimony. And so they were using the language of caste, and I would never have been using it on my own. I came across it, and it seemed to encapsulate a range of the structure that we often might not even recognize now. and how controlled and how deep the surveillance was, the policing of the boundaries, the smallest possible thing. I mean, it was against law for a Black person or white person to merely play checkers together in Birmingham. I mean, they took it extremely seriously, far more than merely than what a lot of people would assume. We think it's just the water fountains, the restrooms, but it was every aspect of life. And so I was using that. So anyone who read The Warmth of the Suns has been exposed to the concept. The Caste is used throughout the book. I don't use other work language that one might expect. And yet I was called to do this book or begin thinking about something else after the Trayvon Martin case. And when the Trayvon Martin case was, we remind ourselves that in 2012, this was a 17-year-old boy who was walking home from the convenience store in the middle of a basketball game. It was halftime, and he never made it home, obviously, because a man saw him, George Zimmerman, saw him, intruded in that moment, and took his life. Because George Zimmerman said he looked like he was up to no good. He was out of his place. He didn't belong there, and is how George Zimmerman perceived it. And one of the reasons why this got my attention was because, first of all, that part of Florida is where someone in the Warmth of the Suns was from, so I knew the area very well. But secondly, it was the fact that it did not adhere to the usual Black and white paradigm that we're accustomed to. In other words, it was not so easily explained because here it was, George Zimmerman was actually of Latinx descent. So it was not a straightforward explanation of what we think of as racism in the classical sense. And not to suggest that wasn't a part of it, but it was a change in the narrative, and it suggested that it was not as easily explainable. And so I wrote a piece in the New York Times, an op-ed piece, connecting it to caste, because caste it has to do with assumptions of where a person belongs in the hierarchy, and that people who might feel anyone in the society can enforce it. Their enforcers can be of any background. And here he was enforcing a caste system and enforcing a hierarchy, which also was denigrating him as well. And yet this was a way for him to move up in the hierarchy by being the surveiller of this young man. And so that's what first got me to think that, there needs to be more done. I mean, there apparently wasn't enough done. There needs to be more. And then each case after case after case, Tamir Rice, Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, Jonathan Crawford, Jonathan Farrell, so many names now, Ahmaud Arbery, whose assailants are going on trial today in the state of Georgia. There were so many cases that it seemed as if this was a time that called for a way of understanding some of what we were seeing.
And we are so grateful that you answered that call, because this is incredible work. So it also is clear, it was clear to me, it's clear to anybody reading the book, that you did a tremendous amount of research to write this book. And I wonder, to what extent do you think that your background as a journalist may have guided the process? If you can just tell us a little bit more about what the process was for writing a book like this, which really is incredible historically, but incredible in terms of connecting the dots for us to sort of see the similarities between the three caste systems as you described.
Well, thank you for that question. The work that I do is multidisciplinary at all times, because I'm having to draw upon different approaches to the work. There are times when I'm doing participant observation, more ethnography. There are times when I'm diving in with the perspective of a historian, because the goal is to not describe it from how we look at it now, but what was it like for the people at the time? That's the historian's perspective. Where the journalism comes in, and it's hard to separate out these different aspects of it because it's all now incorporated into me. So it's hard to know, but I can say that the journalist perspective is always one of reaching the largest possible audience, meaning writing it in such a way that a person will want to continue to turn the page. Journalists are keenly aware that at any given moment, an individual who may be reading our work or watching whatever we produce could easily turn the channel. They could check out another app, or they could go on another streaming service. I mean, that we're keenly aware that no one has to read anything that we write. So journalism brings an awareness of the readership, an awareness of what the reader is ready to hear at this juncture in the writing, or what a reader needs to know a little bit more before they can appreciate the next thing. So that's how I would say that journalism affects it. In terms of the approach to the work, I view this work, narrative nonfiction, as being, in some ways, it's a not very well understood, I think, way of writing, because it's very, very difficult to do. It takes a tremendous amount of time to gather the information that would ultimately become the story, and then doing the additional work of telling it in a way that will draw the reader in. So the way that I approach it is one of almost making a quilt, where you have the different pieces that are the elements of the research that you have uncovered, that you have come across, that you have dug deep in order to exhume. And each little piece becomes part of the quilt, and then you start putting it together. And sometimes you might have to take it apart because those pieces they're not lining up the way that it's a smoother transition. So you have to work with that. But ultimately, it's like a quilt, and I don't always know how it's going to look from the very beginning. It's a process, and you add on and you add on and you connect and you move around, and then ultimately you're left with ultimately a book.
That is such a beautiful description of writing. I wish, if I can think of writing a book as a quilt, maybe I'll be able to churn out a book or two in the next few years. That is wonderful. So speaking of quilt, this was a book that was selected by Tufts University School of Medicine's Common Book Read this year. And you have, in your quilt, you've managed to actually also demonstrate how the caste system affects every aspect of life, including the health and healthcare space. So I'd like to talk directly about the intersection of caste and health outcomes, if I may. How do social inequity and caste impact the lifespan of members of the subordinated castes? And if you can also maybe address how can caste-related stress potentially lead to disease and greater health risks, that would be really wonderful to have you sort of have that perspective for the sake of the medically related folks in the audience today.
Yes, it's so interesting. Speaking with you, I'm reminded of how many medical references there are and health connections there are, and one having to do with the opioid crisis, and the fact that because the country did not take seriously and recognize that substance abuse was at the core of the previous drug challenges that we've faced as a country, whether it was heroin in the 60s or crack in the 80s and 90s, because we had not taken that seriously as a country, and partly because the group of people were devalued, speaking of in a caste system, it's a value, it's a graded ranking of human value, and the people who were suffering in this in the previous iterations were of the devalued group, and therefore wasn't taken seriously. Now that put people at risk this is an example of how anyone can be affected by this, because if you're not paying attention, then you're not creating the policies that will embed standards for how you treat human beings when they are experiencing dependence on a substance. But because of the dehumanization of the people who were suffering before, we were unprepared for the opioid crisis. So that means that there are people in the more favored group today who are subjected to and suffering in ways that perhaps if we'd gotten on top of it decades before, we would not be in the situation we are in now. The other thing that I'm reminded of with that is that shockingly, to this day, and there's been study after study after study, I'm sure obviously you are more familiar with them than I am, empirical studies that show that there are far too many medical practitioners who still believe the stereotype, the fiction that Black people do not experience pain to the same degree as their white counterparts. I mean, it's shocking and stunning. And this is an example of how the fact that Black people are under-medicated for their pain stems from that stereotype, but also it had the different effect on those who were in the favored caste, because they were the favored group because they were over-medicated for pain. And so, and thus became more susceptible to illness and death as a result of overdoses. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it that I want to mention, though, is the effect on everyone when it comes to discrimination, the ways, the studies that are showing that discrimination has a visible effect, a very real effect on the health and, in fact, lifespan of those who are subjected to it. And I was reminded of, haunted really by a man that I had the chance to talk to who happened to have been from Nigeria. And he'd been in this country since he was 20 or so, and he'd gone to college here. And he said he was now in his 50s. And he said he was telling me he'd just come back from the doctor, and the doctor had said that he had diabetes and hypertension. And he was very obviously stunned to hear this because it had not run in his family. And his own father, who was in his 90s back in Nigeria, did not have diabetes or heart disease or hypertension. He didn't have it. So it was not genetic. It had nothing to do. It was the man said, this is what it means to spend 30 years as a Black man in this country. And I'm haunted by that. And so we also know that there's this phenomenon known as weathering, which is where essentially the ends of the cells shorten as a result of the exposure to the stressors that come from being marginalized, having to push against the assumptions and stereotypes, expectations of who should be doing what in a society. And that it has a tremendous effect on those who are on the front lines of these boundaries, which would be people who are in spaces where Black people are not expected to be, whether it's in STEM. I myself, when I was at the New York Times, just showing up to interview a man, and he refused to believe I was with the New York Times and told me to leave because he said the New York Times will be here any minute and I'm going to have to ask you to leave. So, I mean, this has an effect. It has it has a measurable effect on the life expectancy even of people who are subjected to this.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Those are great examples of the connection between health outcomes and the caste system. Thank you so much. So medicine itself is known to be very hierarchical. And for our future health professionals, this means that they will find themselves needing to navigate this hierarchy, even as they aim to achieve their own professional goals, right? They're not going to necessarily have to do anything that's sort of self-destruct. And yet Tufts believes that we are developing and educating leaders who can change the system from within. And so I wonder what advice you might have for future physicians, future public health professionals who are in this, and other health professionals who are in this audience at this phase in their journey, and what you would suggest they do to be sure that they don't lose sight of these important issues and their role in helping to dismantle it as they move through their career.
Well, one of the reasons that I put an emphasis on history is because when you look at the history, it helps you to have an understanding of what it is that we're dealing with now. And then also another thing that I emphasize in the work that I'm doing is to show how we're all either helped when we are thinking in a more egalitarian way, and how we're harmed when we are not. When we exclude, we're actually harming ourselves, not just those who are being excluded. And part of the way of overcoming that is to recognize the contributions, the gifts, the talents, the perspective that can be gained when a person brings in someone who might not have been there before, but can bring a different perspective. And I was gonna share with you one example that I don't have in the book, and actually I've never even spoken about this before, but I just wanted to give it, something you said made me want to think of it. And that was that I was once in a situation where I was needing, where we were needing to move a very, very heavy radiator, one of those big old radiators, from one space to another in a house. And the man was trying to move it, literally trying to move it with his, and was not able to move it. Because I had a different perspective as a woman who knew from the beginning there was no way I could move it. I was not going to be able to move it. I said, why don't we just put like a blanket underneath it and then just move it that way? And do you know, it worked. It worked. It was the way to move something that may have weighed, 300 pounds or more. And we were able to just glide it across the floor with no problem.
Oh my God.
That is an example of how different perspectives can actually strengthen decision-making, can strengthen an institution, can strengthen disciplines. We need to hear from as many different people as possible, and we all have something to contribute. And that's just one example of it.
Oh, that's a beautiful example. Thank you so much for sharing that. And speaking about hearing from different perspectives, I can go on chatting with you. I can ask you more questions, but I also know that there are other perspectives in the audience, and there are others who may want to ask questions. So I think we're going to turn over now to Jess, who I think has a lineup of others who want to ask questions of Ms. Wilkerson.
Good evening. Ms. Wilkerson, thank you so much for sharing time with us and space with us today. I'm Damian Archer. I'm a faculty at the medical school and assistant dean for multicultural affairs. The question I have for you this evening is, what is the most impactful lesson that you learned while writing the book Caste that can help to dismantle caste systems everywhere?
Well, that's a big question. That's a very big question. I have to go back to Germany, because Germany was in the book only because I was looking to see what did Germany do in the years after the war. I was looking for examples of overcoming somehow. Not to suggest that it's perfect. They just had an election that was very, very close, and they're in transition now. But I was looking for ways of understanding, not just to leave us with just the dire circumstances that we have inherited, perhaps, but to look for how have others dealt with this. And I would say that, it was very sobering to see the lengths to which they felt they needed to go, and instructive to see the lengths to which they felt they needed to go in order to counteract that which they were trying to address. In other words, there are no monuments whatsoever to those who were the oppressors in that situation. There are no street names. There's nothing named after them. The places of horror have been converted into places of learning. Children, young people learn about the history from as early as they can begin to understand why one group would be up against another group, and it continues on through their learning. They're the only monuments, and there are many, many monuments embedded in the society, and those monuments are solely to those who either perished as a result of the Holocaust or who resisted the Holocaust. And they do so. In other words, they have determined They have shown what they value. They have shown who they value. They have shown who is worthy of honor and elevation, and who should be put in as a place of in some ways a cautionary tale to make sure it never happens again. So that's one of the things that they do. Another thing is that, of course, they do not. It's against the law to show the signage, the swastika. It's against the law to do any of the signals, the hand signals that would be associated with them, with the Nazis. And they also do not have the death penalty, and that's because the death penalty they are not because of what they did, because of what happened there. They feel that they cannot actually even be entrusted with that is not something that the history forbids them from doing that. That's how seriously they take it. And yet in our country, the states that had the highest number of lynchings also have, to a state, capital punishment. They have the death penalty. So we have not incorporated the history into how we see ourselves. We have not sought to correct, atone, and redress and repair the tremendous damage to the entire country, but particularly to those who were the targets of it. So those are some of the things that they have had a methodical approach at every level of society to address the issue. Again, that doesn't mean that it's perfect, but it means that they are doing what they can, and they take it very, very seriously.
Thank you so much.
I think we have time for one more question. Jess, you have another person who is about to ask a question, I believe.
Yes, good evening. Thank you very much. My name is Sequala Hollis Coleman. I graduated from Jackson in 1979. I'm also a parent of 2 African-American boys, one of whom graduated from Tufts in 2011. I have enjoyed both of your books, and the question that I have for you, as a wonderful writer that you are, how do you remain optimistic as you write such detailed atrocities? How do you, because the optimism comes out in your writing. So how do you explain that?
Thank you for that. Thank you. I would say that, I kind of teeter between despair and optimism, the truth of the matter is. And I wouldn't embark upon it if I didn't think that there was a chance to somehow transcend that which we've inherited. In other words, the whole point of doing it, what would be the point of doing it if you didn't have a hope that somehow you can put that one more chisel against this, this concrete mountain that we're trying to, level so that we can have a fairer society. I couldn't do the work if I didn't feel that it could potentially have an impact, that it could potentially affect both hearts and minds, and thus, the society. So that's what keeps me going, is the fact that I'm doing it. The fact that I'm writing is an act of faith, an act of hope. Optimism might be too strong a word, but I would say hope and faith. That maybe not in our time, but at some point in the future, that this will be one path toward making this a fairer society. Again, it's, none of us will be alive when there's parity between enslavement and freedom for Black people in this country. So all we can do is do our part to make sure that succeeding generations know what we've been through and know what's happened. It's a documenting of where we happen to be, in hopes that we can transcend it and find our way out.
Well, thank you so much. And I so appreciate the question from Ms. Coleman, because I think that ending on hope is a good place to actually bring this event to a close. Ms. Wilkerson, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
spending time with us. Thank you for you have enhanced and broadened our thinking about the systems that exist in this country and how we can reframe and think about it. And more importantly, how we can also empower our students as they graduate to help to dismantle it. Thank you so much. It's been a delight. And I also want to thank everybody who joined us today in this broadcast. Thank you. And of course, I want to thank Tisch College for co-sponsoring this event alongside with the Tufts University School of Medicine. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.